Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Onge. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. Now that Joe Biden's out of office, they're coming clean with the numbers. On Friday, the Atlanta Fed's current GDP estimate crashed from 2.3% growth to negative 1.5%. As in, we could be in a recession that started 3 weeks before Trump took office. So the Atlanta Fed puts out these reports grabbing snips of data to estimate GDP for the entire country. Historically, at this stage, just 2 months into the quarter, it's not very accurate, plus or minus 1.5%, meaning we could be flat on GDP or we could be in a 2008 level recession. What's driving the drop is a collapse in consumer spending and a rise in the savings rate. Now, normally those are indicators of recession, so people stop spending and start saving because winter is coming. Thing is, at the moment, those numbers are dominated by government spending. As in, if you lay off tens of thousands of government workers and cut $60 billion in transgender operas, that's going to show up as a big month-to-month drop. Or, as Zero Hedge put it, quote, "It has nothing to do with consumer retrenching and everything to do with the U.S. no longer funding opera lessons for transsexual guinea pigs in Bora Bora." Throw in a one-off jump in imports to dodge tariffs and the come down from Biden's pre-election surge in federal spending. Elections do not buy themselves, and the quarter-on-quarter will look terrible, but it's not necessarily flagging distress. It's flagging that the country is healing. Now, this is the paper recession that I've talked about in recent videos, coming from the fact we bizarrely count government waste as GDP. To give a sense, when Javier Milei slashed government by 6% of GDP, Argentina's GDP dropped by 3.5%. In other words, the real economy grew by 2.5%, but government cuts overwhelmed it. Happily, that was followed by projections for 8.5% growth as government waste converts into growth. Of course, we've seen this before in America. After World War II, we demobilized 11 million soldiers. That caused an 11.2% drop in GDP in 1946, one of the worst in our history, which of course set the stage for the 1950s miracle that doubled American GDP. Now, in theory, we could have kept those 11 million on the payroll marching in circles and skipped the 46 recession. Instead, we took the GDP hit to turn swords and transgender operas into plowshares. So what's next? A lot of what Trump is doing will shrink GDP on paper. Cutting government spending, covering government workers, and mass deportation all cut slabs of GDP that were actually making us poor. Meanwhile, his reforms, cutting taxes, freeing up regulations, and drill baby drill, all take time. You've got to stand up the factory, start the business, drill new holes. So he's cutting the fat fast, but building the muscle takes time, and in the meantime, our weight does go down. Currently, odds for a recession in 2025 are running 28% on prediction betting site Kalshi. That's way down from 54% on the eve of the election, but it's still 28% odds that we get that paper recession. If so, sit tight. Going by the 1950s, it gets a lot better. Here come the tariffs. Last week, Donald Trump announced 25% tariffs on goods imported from Canada and Mexico, 10% on Canadian oil, would go into effect. These were the same ones that were paused last month after both countries beefed up their borders, but I guess it wasn't enough. He also announced 10% tariffs on China. These would be on top of the current China tariffs, ranging from 17.5% to 35%. Now, he tied all these new tariffs to the ongoing flow of fentanyl across the border that killed some 70,000 Americans last year, more than the Vietnam War. So it's still possible these countries will come up with something to once again delay them. But the nuclear tariff is what's coming in April, a wave of reciprocal tariffs on every major trading partner, including Europe, Japan, and Korea. Now, the idea of reciprocal tariffs is instead of negotiating 1,000-page so-called free trade deals that sell out American manufacturing in return for concessions to Wall Street, Hollywood, and Pfizer, instead you keep it simple. You just say, if you tariff us, we tariff you. The trick, of course, is it can't be one for one. For example, if Singapore tariffs U.S. soybeans and then we tariff their soybeans, well, they're a city. They don't make any soybeans. So instead, you go big picture and ask, what are they selling to us, and hit them where it hurts. For example, Europe uses so-called non-tariff barriers to lock out made-in-America cars, beef, pork, and yes, soybeans. Electronics are blocked by recycling rules, medical devices are blocked by the European FDA, timber by provenance rules. Cars get an encyclopedia of protectionist rules to shelter Germany, who's destroying themselves with green energy. And then the big one, the VAT, the value-added tax. This is basically a sales tax, but much higher, so it's about 22% across Europe. The problem is it hits American goods, but Europe exempts its own exports. That means Europe is charging us about 18% more than we charge them, effectively in tariffs. Incidentally, this VAT tariff is true for most countries, including Canada, Mexico, and China. Of course, one solution is to hike our sales tax and get rid of the income tax in return. Alas, for now, Trump is trying to level the playing field. The trick with all this is calculating and then distributing where it hurts. So adding up the non-tariff barriers, the VAT, and then hitting French cheese, Chinese watches, Canadian dog food. With 13,000 trade categories, that all takes a while, which is probably why they're aiming for April. So what's next? The special tariffs on Canada and Mexico may come and go depending if they play ball in the border. But the reciprocal tariffs are likely to stay a while. So what happens to inflation? While tariffs are taxes, a lot will be absorbed either by their currency falling, so the Canadian dollar plunged last time Trump threatened tariffs, or by governments paying for the tariffs as China is doing. What's left won't hit immediately since importers have been stockpiling. And of course, ideally, we never see hikes because these countries end their wicked ways and we drop the reciprocals, or their companies give up and relocate to the U.S., which is very likely if taxes and regulations are cut enough. More important, broad inflation is driven by government spending, not tariffs. So if we cut spending, whether DOGE or ending the wars, inflation falls a lot more than tariffs could ever hike. Bidenomics failed because government spending grew like a cancer. If Trump can fix that, his entire program will be a success. A word from our lead sponsor, Unchained.com. In the new year, it's time to think about your annual IRA contributions. An IRA is an investment vehicle that can save you a lot of taxes. With Unchained, you can hold real Bitcoin in your IRA, get access to trading, inheritance, and loans, and it's the only company where you hold the keys and can verify that your Bitcoin is not being relent like banks do. We've seen futures-based ETFs underperform holding your own Bitcoin, so why settle for less? Book a friendly consultation at unchained.com/Peter. If you own gold or silver, you know they're a great hedge against financial instability and let you grow your wealth outside the banking system and gain greater control over your finances. Monetary Metals offers you the ability to increase your precious metal ounces every single month. Instead of paying to own metal, with Monetary Metals, you get paid 4% on your gold paid in more ounces. Now's the time to secure your wealth and build your legacy in an asset that the government cannot inflate away. Join thousands of investors earning interest in physical gold and silver every month with Monetary Metals. Visit monetarymetals.com/Peter to learn more. Now back to our show. How many trillions do international organizations steal from the American people? Europe's angry reaction to Donald Trump's smackdown of petite entertainer Vladimir Zelensky is raising questions why the U.S. continues paying for Europe's defense. Based Utah Senator Mike Lee summed it up, posting, quote, "Exit NATO." This is a great idea, given NATO bleeds us for hundreds of billions of dollars and gives us nothing but a tripwire for World War III. But it does raise the question, what else should we exit? After all, we fund dozens of major organizations like the IMF, World Bank, World Health Organization, even the United Nations. We know what they give us, eroded sovereignty and a grievance factory for anti-Americanism. But what do we give them? So most of these were created in 1945 as a shadow global government. Since then, inflation adjusted, we've given them over $8 trillion. Add in what we've paid to their pet NGOs, and it could be closer to $2 trillion. Perhaps DOGE, we'll find out. That includes at least $250 billion to the United Nations, another $300 billion to the IMF and World Bank, $50 billion in so-called development banks in Africa and Asia that print money for local elites, and infamously the World Health Organization that uses our taxes to produce totalitarian lockdowns. As for the NGOs, we pay UN-linked NGOs like Oxfam and the Soros-backed Amnesty International, WHO-linked NGOs like Bill Gates' Global Fund Partners, tens of billions to NATO-linked NGOs like Atlantic Council and Endowment for Democracy, who try and start wars, as well as many more billions to migrant traffickers and outfits that operate like FEMA for the world, well, the world minus Maui and North Carolina. But that's where it gets fun, because beyond the trillions we've given the globalists is the wars we have fought for them. Inflation adjusted, we spent at least $1.3 trillion on Iraq, $3.2 trillion on Afghanistan, so $4.5 trillion for nothing. For perspective, we spent a smidge more, about $5.7 trillion on World War II. Alas, the wars are just the tip of the iceberg, because going by peers, at least 2/3 of our entire defense budget is for other countries, either protecting them or killing their enemies, rather than actually protecting our country. That includes 750 overseas bases in nearly 80 countries, numbering over 160,000 American soldiers, plus more than 50,000 civilian contractors. It includes 11 aircraft carrier strike groups, each with 6 to 9 capital ships and up to 70 advanced fighters, and support aircraft on top of a city-sized aircraft carrier, all steaming around the world as floating tripwires so no military contractor goes hungry. Now, considering we've spent about $30 trillion inflation-adjusted on defense since 1945, that suggests something like $20 trillion went on foreigners. In other words, most of our entire national debt was either given to foreigners or spent flipping between protecting them for free and killing them for free. So what's next? Between playing Uncle Sugar, world policeman, and tripwired to the stars, we are bleeding our country dry. Trump recently floated cutting military spending by half if we can reduce tensions with Russia and China. If we quit the world policeman racket, we could bump that to 3/4, taking what's left, 500,000 men, to actually protect our own country. Is the gold in Fort Knox? What if it's missing? Donald Trump and Elon Musk want to visit Fort Knox to see if the gold really is there, with Trump adding, quote, "We'll be very upset if it's not." There's been a question in the gold community for years. Is the gold that's allegedly sitting in the world's vaults actually there? Is it actually gold? Is it mortgaged, quietly lent out in a system called rehypothecation? It's not a crazy question. A partial audit of Fort Knox in the 1970s found, quote, discrepancies, including melted bars. In 2020, a dozen major Chinese trust companies faced collapse when 83 tons of gold turned out to be gold-plated copper. Between 2017 and 19, J.P. Morgan identified at least 1,000 gold bars with forged refinery logos that were in circulation, essentially black market gold. An Australian senator recently made waves pushing their central bank to audit Australia's gold, which is nearly all held on trust in London. Now, it's well known that Fort Knox gold is low purity, because unusual for a national gold reserve, it is made from melted coins, not mined gold. Why melted coins? Because the 8,133 metric tons in Fort Knox, allegedly, were seized from the American people by Franklin Roosevelt when he abrogated the gold standard. They are stolen goods. Now, that abrogation effectively defaulted every single contract in America right down to your landlord, because they all had gold clauses, as well as most major contracts in the entire world. This was FDR's infamous Order 6102 that banned the private ownership of gold in 1933. You had to turn it in for just over half what it was worth or face up to 10 years in prison. Among the contracts this defaulted were the Liberty bonds that patriotic Americans had bought to finance World War I. These summed to roughly 5% of GDP, so about $1.5 trillion in modern terms. So that's where most of the gold in Fort Knox should have gone, to ripped-off patriots. Instead, Liberty bonds were screwed, while millions of Americans had to hand over the gold for half what it was worth. It was melted down, and there remains the world's largest pile of stolen gold. So what's next? The gold is probably there, but what happens if Fort Knox is just another Chinese Ponzi? Well, it would drive up the price of physical gold, coins, and bullion. It would catastrophically crash so-called paper gold, the highly leveraged constellation of gold-backed assets, including the $70 billion ETF GLD. These gold-backed assets trade more than 10 times all the gold in existence. Now, if Fort Knox is fake, these outfits would immediately audit their gold, which would either calm the storm or accelerate it if they too are short. More important, fear would spread whether other government numbers are accurate. What else is not audited? This could conceivably crash the price of U.S. Treasuries, which are the reserve currency asset, the liquidity of the entire global financial system. It'd be even worse for countries in Europe, Asia, or Latin America who enjoy even less public confidence in their governments. After all, if the Pope is a fraud, what to make of your local padre? So the gold is probably there. If it isn't, things could get very interesting. A word from our sponsor. One of the best ways to secure your Bitcoin is with a hardware wallet, a physical device that lets you keep your coins offline without internet connection. One of the most trusted names in hardware wallets is CoinKite, maker of the famous block clock. CoinKite devices are made in Canada and they're run by passionate Bitcoiners who've been at this since 2012, back when Bitcoiners were trading in person at swap meets. You can pick up hardware wallets and plenty of other goodies at coinkite.com/Prof. St. Ange. That's COINKITE.com/Prof. St. Ange. Okay, back to our show. Should government spending be part of GDP when we cut government waste? Should the statistics count it as making us poor? Last Sunday, Commerce Secretary Lutnick told Maria Bartiromo that government statistics will start counting GDP, breaking out government spending. Last week, Elon Musk posted that government spending shouldn't be included in GDP at all because, quote, you could shift everyone who is building cars to working at the DMV and GDP would appear the same. Musk is right. In fact, it could actually raise GDP if you pay government workers enough. The reason is GDP counts output, the market price of a car, but for government, there is no output with a market price, so government statisticians just count their salary. That means you could close every car factory in America, give them government jobs looking out the window, and your GDP could actually go up, which is retarded. So in theory, GDP counts the value of all final goods and services produced in a country. Most people use this as a stand-in for prosperity. As in, if GDP is going up, we're getting rich. If it's going down, we're in bad shape. In fact, if it goes down for 6 months in a row, 2 quarters, it's the classic definition of a recession. That's basically true for the private sector. Rising GDP means more production, which makes us rich. With the caveat, of course, that lots of valuable things are not in GDP because they're not priced, things like raising kids. But when it comes to the government, GDP falls apart. Not only because government counts spending, not output, but because even what government does produce is so bad. For example, public schools in Chicago spend $28,702 per student, a princely sum, yet just 22% of Chicago 11th graders are, quote, proficient at reading. Only 18% are proficient in math. So you could make a case that Chicago public school GDP isn't producing anything. In fact, it's subtracting. It's a machine for turning perfectly good kids into illiterates and perfectly good school buildings into day prisons. It gets worse because remember, every dollar government spends, it has to take first, meaning it's not production, it's redistribution, just like if a thief stole it. So theft creates wealth when government is keeping the score. So what's the solution? Milton Friedman suggested radically discounting government spending, both for the low quality and for the redistribution. Murray Rothbard wanted to fully exclude government from GDP since it's coerced redistribution, or to count it negative by including the deadweight costs of the taxes, inflation, and debt it took to finance it. So what's next? If government spending doesn't count as GDP, it explains why voters were not seeing the Biden miracle. Because under Joe Biden, government grew 3 times faster than the economy, making up for nearly half of paper GDP growth. Given population grew faster than that, that means Biden was a 4-year per capita recession for everything but the federal government. It's even more important for what's coming next, because if DOGE cuts or ending wars slashes government, that makes us rich. It's less waste, less inflation, less debt. But unless they change GDP, all that wealth will show up as a paper recession that left-wing media will pounce on like a banker on a bailout. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersanons.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.